sheepies! Welcome to the ultimate vintage knitting needle compendium. Now remember, no pointing knitting needles at other people unless you are pretending they are a wand. 2. All of the information in this video is of my own opinion or things I've figured out over the years working with vintage patterns. But I am by no means Elizabeth Zimmerman yet, so if you have any helpful vintage knitting needle tips and tricks or facts, please feel free to help your other knitters by posting them in the comments below. Now that housekeeping is done, let's get into it. Let's start off with the very basic. There are 3 main types of knitting needles: straights, circulars, and double pointeds, otherwise known as DPNs. Each of these needles has their own merits and for one reason or another, depending on the project or the person, could be preferred over the other. Straights offer a very straightforward approach. One way on, one way off, which is lovely for paneled work, flat pieces. Thicker straight needles are usually pretty robust, and one pair of a size will usually last you an entire knitting career, so long as you can keep track of them. I am not as lucky. But smaller straight needles, however, can be a bit trickier. With vintage patterns, your gauge is often quite small, and you're working with yarn that very few people would consider chunky today. I find for most of my 1930s and 40s patterns, the size range is usually between a 2 and a 4. However, adjusting for some interesting yarn choices over the years, I have gone down to double zeros. But that being the case, therein lies the problem. All that length and so skinny can leave you vulnerable to snapping. Oh, especially in a project bag. I mean, I've snapped needles just knitting. Just under the pressure of my hand because they were so skinny. Which brings me to the virtues of our next needle type, circulars. While you can obviously still get them in any size you want, the lack of a super long wooden shank means they are less prone to snapping. They also allow you to knit in the round without having multiple double-pointed needles going, which for a lot of new knitters who can be daunted by double points, it's a really nice fix where you can still do the work in the round without having to worry about managing multiple needles. The only place I find trouble with circular needles sometimes is the plastic center, as sometimes I find it can be a bit overzealously coiled, and it's a bit difficult to work with as the knitting is then spiraling, and it makes the knitting process a bit more difficult. However, a great hack is to get a pot of boiling water or a kettle and to put your needles either in the bowl or dip them into the hot water. Then just pull them till they reach their full extension a few times, and that should have fixed the problem. Circulars are really helpful for working around. Like I said before, prior to the invention of circulars, people who wanted to work in the round would be working with multiple double points. I'm sure many of you have heard the old trope, well, you know, if you want to figure out if a sweater is hand knit, you just look, and if there's no seams, then it's hand knit. Yeah, not f***ing true. I would say about 75% of my hand knit vintage sweaters that I myself have made, I know they're hand knit. They're done in panels. And the patterns are in panels. So maybe it's a way that people were saying this is how you know it precisely, but I don't think it makes a ton of sense. But still, not having to worry that stitches are falling off the back end of your needles while you're working in the round is a hell of an innovation, especially when looking at vintage color work. However, there is one area where circulars can fall short, which is when you get to very small rounds or very small sections that are tight. And it's difficult to angle your hands in to get a proper handle on your knitting because there needs to be that extra area. This is where a technique called magic loop can come into help. Magic loop is where you pull the circular cord away from your stitches and create this excess of the needle with no stitches on it. A loop that allows you to continue knitting with the circulars even if the space is too small to angle your needles. However, there is a downside to this. The pull of the loop can stretch your stitches somewhat and change the tension slightly. My recommendation is that if you're going to try magic loop, try to place the loop in a different place every round. Don't repeat that. Rather than having the problem that you're then trying to take a needle and stretch between the stitches, it's not going to work. So rotate where you place that loop so your tension is just maybe slightly off in 1 or 2 places. every few rounds rather than same place every round, and that's a lot harder to fix with blocking. Which brings us full circle to the DPNs, otherwise known as double-pointed needles. These are the OG circulars, let's be honest, and in my opinion, the most versatile of the three. You can do I-cords, gloves, hats, anything really. If you look at traditional Shetland knitting, you'll even find they have extra long DPNs. I'm talking like 1.5 foot long DPNs, which they would secure into a belt and then be able to knit while walking. DPNs allow access to knitting in big areas with the Shetland style, and the small areas we are very used to using them for, like socks. Big or small, there's no limit to how many you can have going in around. And in a second, I want to talk about how knitting needle material plays into this. But before we get there, I really want to acknowledge how much vintage and traditional knitting patterns are really meant for straight and double-pointed needles. And so, yes, we can use circular needles to replace those, make our lives a little bit easier. I do it all the time. I do it all the time. But if you look at a pattern sometimes and the rows aren't making sense, or you're setting up an armhole and what they're telling you isn't quite making sense, sometimes it's really helpful to go back and look at what needles they originally wanted you to use. Funny story, I was just a few days ago working on this Shetland Fair Isle pattern. It's a beautiful sweater, and they were like, so now to add the armhole, you are going to work to needle 2. And I'm here having a heart attack because we've been working in the round for like 16 inches. So I took a look at it and what I ended up coming up with was that this was knit for 2 straight needles, and then it would be worked on a belt. So actually the front and back would have been just on 2 very large double points. And by negating that and using the circular, I wasn't seeing where they wanted me to place the sleeve. So actually it was really helpful to go back and realize that I was using a different type of needle, but it's just a difference between the way vintage patterns are written and a lot of modern patterns are written. And coming into the slightly obvious issue with DPNs, slipping, we come into the question of knitting needle material, I guess is what we're going to call it, what the knitting needles are made of. So DPNs are notorious for having slipping going on. I mean, say you're turning the heel of a sock. So say you're putting your knitting in your bag and you realize that a few have slipped, well, you can fix it right there. My worst case scenario is always when you put it in the bag and then when you get it back out and you're like, oh my god, 5 different stitches have slipped off and now I have to start my crafting for today, cursing and freaking out and being pissed off because I'm having to pick up stitches. I can't just go into the thing that I like. But something that can actually help with this is your choice of material, both yarn and needle. Now, slippery yarns are always going to be a pain in the neck. As I'm sure you figured out, I prefer to use wooden needles when given the choice, but I also have a lot of friends who prefer metal needles. I don't, however, have any friends who like plastic needles above all else. If you do, I'd be very interested to hear from you in the comments as to why. For me, wood and bamboo needles are lighter, meaning I can work for longer periods of time without tiring out. Metal, I find, especially when working with over a size 5 or 6, my arms just end up tiring out way faster. And while metal needles are heavier and I do find them a little bit slipperier, they do have the benefit of not being snappable. I mean, if you have snapped a metal needle, again, comment section, I need to know. Plastic, on the other hand, I see as a bit of both worlds, but I rarely see them in the sizes I need for vintage knitting. Mostly you're going to see them in hobby stores like Michael's or our dearly departed Joanne Fabrics. And there is no needle shaming here. If you like plastic needles, fucking good for you. Now we need to address the elephant in the room. Whether you live in the US, UK, EU, Australia, when looking at vintage patterns, you are about to see some wild shit. Patterns calling for sizes 12 and 13. Meanwhile, the gauge is tiny. Well, you're not crazy, I'll tell you that much. Needle sizes have changed, simple as that. Just in the way that standardized dress sizes and clothing sizes have changed, knitting needles too underwent a revolution, which you can see not only in different countries, but also in different brands and different eras. So often when working with vintage needles and vintage patterns, Gauge, cannot stress enough. Even more than normal, check your fucking gauge. Check your fucking gauge, please. But for a rough starting point, here is a chart with rough equivalencies for like 1930s and 40s knitting needles to modern day knitting needles. Now you can go by a chart like this, or I know that some Etsy pattern sellers for vintage knitting patterns will attach a similar chart like this to the end of their patterns. We love you. Thank you. If not, you can find a needle board, like a gauge finder. I have these two different ones in my collection, and I use them to double check what I already know if, say, the marking has already worn off on the side of a knitting needle from overuse, and I don't know exactly what size it is anymore. But hey, we've all been there. Last resort, Google. Google is a great tool for this. Lots of knitting needle size conversion charts, lots of like those little like generators and stuff where you can see which era, which kind of woozy thing is required. Floats your boat? Do it. I have found that knowing myself, knowing what kind of knitting needles I will be most comfortable with, and what materials I enjoy has really influenced not only my knitting enjoyment, but also the results of my patterns over the years. And finding out that knitting needle sizes changed? I mean, I started knitting at 4. I didn't start doing vintage knitting until I was 16. When I found out that there had been this massive shift and I needed to do all this extra stuff, which is leading into a future project soon, by the way, so yes, I will be remaking one of my earliest vintage knits and seeing the differences. But I was like, mind blown. Thank you so much for stopping by. I hope you found this video helpful and maybe a little bit fun. I had so much fun talking to you about vintage knitting needles, and I can't wait to hear all your comments and talk with you guys there. It is one of the highlights for me of making YouTube videos is getting to engage with all of you guys and talk about knitting. Seriously, it's I love it. So thank you so much for stopping by, and I will see you next time. Bye, sheepies!